Well, thanks for everyone for coming, and welcome to the very first seminar in the SOAR seminar series. This is a new series at Saïd Business School, and we're delighted so many of you are able to attend today. We have a terrific set of speakers, and I think it's going to really be an exciting seminar series as it develops and progresses. For background, for some of you will know this and some of you won't, depending on your connection to the business school and to the center. This is a seminar series that is sponsored by the Center for Corporate Reputation at Saïd Business School at the University of Oxford. This is an independent research center in the school that aims to understand how the reputations of organizations are created, sustained, enhanced, destroyed, and rehabilitated. And the center takes a very broad understanding of reputation. It includes issues of legitimacy and stigma, all kinds of mechanisms and ways in which organizations, also writ broadly, are evaluated in the social world. The seminar series that we are kicking off today, called SOAR, is aiming to provoke a dialogue on stigma, authenticity, organizations, and reputation. And those weren't chosen only because they could spell the word SOAR, but obviously that was a bonus. Our focus in this series is on understanding how businesses and other organizations deal with issues around stigma, authenticity, and reputation in the context of grand challenges, but also the day-to-day operations of organizations that face these issues on an ongoing basis. I want to say a kind of special shout out to our International Research Fellows. Thank you very much for being here. And hopefully, I think you will find a lot in this series of interest to you. I know it's been a challenging year for us to get together, and so hopefully this will be a nice way for us to reach out and meet you. I should have introduced myself. My name is Tom Lawrence. I'm a professor of strategy at the business school, also affiliated with the center. I've been here for about 6 years, and working with the center and the postdocs is really one of the highlights of my interactions in the business school. Today, though, more importantly, we have two fantastic guests who are going to have a conversation with you and in front of you, Dr. Neil Stott and Professor Paul Tracy. Neil is a professor in management practice at the Cambridge Judge Business School. He is also the director of the Masters of Studies in Social Innovation program and a co-director of the Cambridge Center for Social Innovation. In 2017, he won the University of Cambridge Vice Chancellor's Public Engagement with Research Award. And this award, I think, is very reflective of what makes Neil so special, because he brings to the conversation both a deep, embedded knowledge and experience of social innovation and social enterprise, and a deep commitment to scholarship and learning. And you'll see that in our conversation today. Prior to moving to Cambridge, and this is important for today, Neil was the chief executive of Keystone Development Trust up until 2015. And before that, he worked in local government, in charities, and in community projects. Professor Paul Tracy is also a great friend of Oxford. Even though he's at the Cambridge Judge Business School, he's a professor of innovation and organization there, and we want to welcome him and Neil. His work focuses on how entrepreneurs and other organizations create value of different kinds, not just economic value, but social value, and looking broadly at the potential outcomes and valuable outcomes of organizations, how they accomplish that. In 2014, and again, this is important for the talk today, he co-founded the Cambridge Center for Social Innovation and is currently the co-director. The center is a really important and interesting institution within an institution. It creates knowledge about social innovation and social change. It offers a master's degree in social innovation. It supports social entrepreneurs through an incubator, and it also supports a great deal of research around social enterprise and social innovation through a network of researchers, postdocs, and all through significantly through Neil and Paul's activities. Paul, many of you will know through his publications in the Academy Management Journal, the Academy Management Review, Journal of Marketing, Organization Science, and other publications. Today, what we're going to do is a little bit different than a traditional paper presentation. what we have asked Neil and Paul to do is have a conversation and lead a conversation about stigma organizations and social enterprise based on a study that was done a few years ago in which Paul and Neil were both central. I'll let them talk to you about it. Just in terms of the format, we decided to do this in Zoom meeting format so that we could eventually turn all our cameras on and have a conversation. But I'm going to do the opposite for the first few minutes, which is kind of unusual in a Zoom meeting. I'm actually going to ask you to turn your cameras off just for the first 20 minutes. And that will allow us to kind of focus on Neil and Paul's conversation. And then after they finish, we'll start having a Q&A in which we'll turn our cameras back on. We'll have much more of a kind of engaged conversation with everyone. The conversation will be largely moderated through the chat. And so when you have questions, feel free to put them in there, either during their conversation or afterward. I'll moderate that, and possibly with the help of, I'll get Ava Schlinvine and Rohini, who are really the instigators of SOAR, to introduce themselves a little bit later. So we won't stop anything now from happening. We'll turn it over to Professor Paul Tracy.
Thank you very much, Tom. Thank you very much for inviting Neil and I to speak at your first seminar. Really privileged to be able to do this. So yeah, as Tom said, we're going to try and make it informal because we know that people have a lot of Zoom PowerPoint presentations on Zoom. So I'm just going to set the scene for 5 minutes or so, and then I'm going to turn to Neil to ask some questions. And then if we've got time, he'll turn to me and we'll ask him, he'll ask some questions of me. So thank
you. Good morning, everybody. Regarding activities from
the case that we're going to talk about today is based on a paper that I published with Nelson Phillips back in 2016 in AMJ that features Neil as the main protagonist. But the project really goes back to 2011 when I was awarded an ESRC mid-career fellowship. And the point of those fellowships was to buy busy faculty like myself out for a couple of years so you can collect some data. And so I'd applied to do an ethnography of a social enterprise. And then when I got the money, I had to figure out a social enterprise to go and study and do this ethnography in. And so I asked Neil. Neil was one of my first students back in 2003 or 4 when I first joined the journal. I said to Neil, he was chief executive of this social enterprise called Keystone in the east of England. Neil, would you mind if I came and studied you for 9 to 12 months and do this ethnography? And he said, yes, fine, but don't think you'll be standing in the corner with a notebook just watching. You got to do stuff. So he gave me this title, the acting director of social innovation, he called it. So I'm not exactly sure what that was, but I was doing whole sorts of lots of different tasks for him, from working in the community centre to doing a strategic review of the businesses, anything that would give interesting data, but also help out Neil as well. So originally when I first started, the idea was to do something looking at how social enterprises balance social and commercial tensions, but which in retrospect is actually not that interesting. I thought it was interesting at the time, but when I went into Keystone, when I went into the organization, it was very clear that there was one single issue dominating Keystone and dominating the community, and that was a tension that existed between the local British or English working class population and Eastern European migrants that had come to the town over the past decade. And so to understand what happened at Keystone and to frame the sort of questions I'm going to ask Neil, it probably makes sense just for me to give you a little bit of background about Thetford as a place and what was happening and what I saw when I first arrived at Keystone working with Neil. So Keystone is based in Thetford. Thetford is a town about 30 miles northeast of England, and there's northeast of Cambridge. And there's 2 key historical events that you need to know about to understand contemporary Thetford. The first was that in 1959, Thetford became a London overspill town. So after the Second World War, when there's a shortage of houses in London, the Greater London Authority organised the building of some new towns like Milton Keynes and the expansion of some existing towns like Thetford in order to accommodate people that couldn't be housed in London. So there was this big wave of people from inner city London, mostly poor people, who came to Thetford, who were housed on these social housing estates away from the town with very few amenities, and they quickly became sites of social deprivation. The second key historical event that you need to know about to understand what happened in the questions that I'll ask Neil was in 2004, the so-called A8 European countries, Eastern European countries, joined the EU, and the UK was one of only 3 countries, along with Ireland and Sweden, who allowed people from those countries to come and live and work straight away. And so this precipitated a large migration, about 1.4 million people from Eastern Europe to the UK. And of course, Thetford was just one of many places around the country that they went. And so the population of Thetford increased from about 15,000 to 25,000 in a very short space of time. And that created a lot of different tensions in the community. A lot of the migrants who arrived were vulnerable, and Keystone was one of the few organisations that actually stepped in to support this new group of people who had come to the town. But that created huge tensions and issues for Keystone, because a lot of the English working class people in the town resented the fact that Keystone was spending resources helping the migrants. Also, almost saw Keystone as a kind of a trader. And so what I observed when I first went in was there's this transfer of stigma from the migrant population that had come to Thetford over the past decade, a transfer of stigma from that group to Keystone as an organisation. And, you know, that's created all sorts of tensions inside Keystone. That was the situation that was facing Keystone when I arrived back in 2011. So I want to ask Neil about how he managed that, what happened. But before doing that, Neil, if I can, to get us started, it might be helpful if you were to tell us a little bit more about Keystone. What type of social enterprise is it? And what sort of goals did it have at the time that you led it?
Okay, thanks, Paul. So Keystone was and is still a development trust. A development trust is not a legal model. It's a set of ideas. They are place-based organizations which deliver social projects, but also deliver commercial projects or social enterprises to create income to be able to do the social projects. There are about 500 in the UK, and the model comes from American Community Development Corporations. So Keystone was set up in 2003. I was the first chief executive, with this twin mission of delivering opportunity as well as creating jobs and wealth. We called it creating community capital, social, human, cultural, etc. And
so why did you decide to set up this migrant support service? Did you have an inkling that this was going to be controversial, or was this just something that you thought that you should be doing?
So, you know, Paul's outlined, you know, the frame. So what I need to add is that, you know, migrants on the whole were invited. You know, big employers in the picking, the plucking and the packing agribusinesses, you know, were short of labour, you know, sort of Tesco supply chains, etc. But as they came in, particularly the Portuguese and the Polish initially, there was a lot of resistance. Now, it was the Portuguese initially that, you know, were most sort of discriminated against, in part because of colour. It was quite a shock to white rural Norfolk to have, you know, people coming from different places quite quickly. So what was happening is that we saw increasing racial harassment, we saw exploitation by landlords, we saw, you know, street level discontent and sort of micro harassments going on. Everyday tensions. We saw migrants being exploited by their own community, gangmasters in particular. So it was a real sort of mix, and it was sort of brewing. In my previous jobs, I managed racial harassment services and race equality. And we set up a race equality initiative in Keystone. And we were focusing on, you know, bringing people together. That was the first thing we did. Parties, celebrations, Christmas parties, you name it. But increasingly, we wanted to engage the migrants themselves and empower those migrants to be able to, you know, protect themselves, support themselves. So we set up a thing called META, which is Mobile Europeans Taking Action. And that was a project within Keystone, staffed by people from different migrant communities to deliver services with and on behalf. On one level, yes, I did think it would be contentious because we're doing something a little unpopular, as it happened to be before. I knew it would be slightly unpopular with the other local bodies who were not stepping up at this particular time. And we weren't necessarily shy about it. We were quite proactive in what we did when we set off. I did underestimate the level of backlash, if you like. 1% of our resources, spent on this project, 99% of my mail, my meetings, you name it, for a couple of years. So it was this huge upsurge of dissatisfaction from different parties.
And so can you tell us a little bit about how it felt to be the leader of an organisation that had been very well received amongst the local community, providing a lot of services to lots of different groups of people, to very suddenly go from that situation of being positively evaluated to very quickly being very negatively evaluated, to being stigmatised, as it were?
Well, I think it depends on where you were in the organisation. So thinking about the board members and the staff in particular, it was quite a shock to them. And many were quite unhappy with the experiences they're having, in the community centres. Paul, yourself, you were, abused on a number of occasions by members of the public on this issue, as you well remember. For me, less so. I mean, it was not comfortable. When you're experiencing the level of stigma, we may not have called it that at the time. When you're trying to do well and good in a community, and you are by numerous activities, when people in your own services, let's say the community centre or the Keystone Green Bikes recycling scheme, start ranting about the migrant service, even though they're enjoying our other services, it is quite an uncomfortable place to be. But we had taken a collective decision as an organisation, especially, with my board, that we felt that we were a social justice organisation and we could not stand by and watch a group of our community, suffering quite acutely. Therefore, we felt we were doing the right thing, even though it was a tough going. You just muted yourself, Paul.
Sorry, thank you, Neil. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you actually did in sort of quite concrete terms? So you found yourself in this situation where you felt the community had turned against you. A lot of the staff inside Keystone were very unhappy about what's happening and very upset about what was happening. What did you and the other senior people at Keystone actually do? How did you respond?
Well, for any of you who've managed organisations, you're having to respond in different ways all the time. So some of it was fire brigading, in the sense of, going around talking to people, explaining what you're doing. Some was about reassurance, particularly with the staff team. Some was protecting the staff and obviously the migrants in different ways. But then all the other activities, we just doubled down. We did more integration work. We did more support work. We communicated to allies. This is quite important, beyond our boundaries, who really liked what we were doing, in hope they would then put pressure more locally. So every trick in the book, really, to try and promote, a positive spin on what we were doing. What we never did was back down and say, we're not going to do it, we're going to change the way we're going to do it, which I think is quite important. In terms of practicalities, I mean, we run events. We had community workers working on the streets. We try to bring people together. You know, we gave advice, we created jobs. At every opportunity, we tried to explain to others what the migrant experience was like, as well as support the migrants themselves. So lots of different ways of trying to tackle the issue, which consumed far too much time for a number of reasons, which you've highlighted.
And so if I can finish with my last question to you, which is, what did you learn from this process? I mean, you know, how did the story end, and what did you learn from the process?
Well, I think one thing is you can't please all the people all the time. That's a key message. The other is really about how important it is, if you have made a decision individually and collectively about principles, you try and stick to them. But in doing so, one has to be reflective. You know, you have to listen to the critique, you have to listen to what people are saying to you, and then have to try and respond accordingly. You don't just go back into your shell. That was my key learning from it. I think you also learned, you know, this was not finished. It never finished. It was constant work, constant negotiation with a lot of different parties. And, you know, the work that happened at Keystone and what happened in that area was quite precedent what happened next in British society in terms of, you know, the backlash against migrants, the rise of sort of more far-right groups, and people turning on people who invited and deliver essential services to make sure our salads get on the table or whatever it may be. So yeah, that's what I learned, Paul.
Okay.
So, I mean, turning to you, how did it feel? I mean, you were a poor innocent in this mix. You know, I put you into the front line. You had the Keystone badge on. How did it feel to experience this?
I mean, it was certainly very challenging. I mean, speaking as a researcher, I mean, it was very challenging. Certainly, I was out of my comfort zone. There's no question about that. I mean, I don't know what people at Keystone expected when they were told this person from Cambridge was coming to study them or work with them. I don't know, it probably wasn't quite me, but it was obviously a very different environment to I'm used to, and I was seeing things and hearing things very different to what you would normally see and hear if you're working in a university in a business school. I think more broadly, it kind of reinforced to me the idea that in many ways, business schools are not necessarily great places to study social innovation, and they're very privileged places. In many ways, business schools, of course, are kind of shut off from the most deep-rooted social challenges that we face. And even if you have a school like Said, or you have a school like the Judge Business School, where there's lots of social innovation activity, you might see lots of social entrepreneurs, but you don't see the targets of social entrepreneurs. So a lot of work in our field, I think, is very sanitized. You don't see the reality of a lot of social issues and problems. I mean, thinking specifically about what I learned about social evaluation, I think one of the things that shocked me was the way that rumours spread so quickly across the community, and how that infiltrated organisations really rapidly as well, and how easy it was for organisations to get pulled into that.
You're talking CARP, aren't you?
I'm talking CARP, and I'm talking SWAN. I mean, the SWAN.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, just to tell people, there was one time, you know, I was working in the community centre, and this guy came up to me. He's probably mid-50s, and he came up to me and says, "Paul, have you heard about the Poles and the Swans?" I said, "No, what's going on?" He said, "Oh yeah, well, all the Polish people, they're basically going down the river, they're killing the swans, they're taking their home, and they're eating them." I said, "That's terrible." So I went to one of the community workers and I said, "Robin, have you heard what's happening? There's Poles are going down the river, they're killing the swans, they're eating them." She kind of rolled her eyes and said, "This is one of many rumours that have been started off in the press, in the media, the local media, and spread across really quickly. We've investigated. We haven't found any instances where any swans have been killed by Poles or anywhere else." There was another case, of course, that happened before. This is before I had arrived. It was a story that was told to me by you and many other people about all the complaints that Keystone used to get about street drinking from the migrants. And so Keystone and the local police organised to go around the city to basically find all these migrant street drinkers. But when they did that, they actually didn't find any migrants. They mostly found English people.
Glaswegians, actually, Paul. Scottish.
And a couple of my compatriots moved to the benches of Thetford. But it was really interesting how these rumours spread really, really quickly, and how the implications that had for a community-based organisation that was dealing for tensions inside the community. It was very interesting.
I mean, you know, it's quite an amusing story, but the reality is it has a knock-on effect. You know, the accumulation of those sort of stories has an impact on the doorsteps. You know, and in the everyday interactions, it's you know, people yelling abuse and, you know, harassing, which impacts on people's lives. So, yeah.
That's right. I think it also had an impact on people inside Keystone as well, because the people who work at Keystone are part of the community also.
Yes, indeed. And because one, if you remember, Paul, that's, you know, members of staff used to come to you and say, you know, they're really concerned because they're part of the community, you know, they're part of the white English Thetfordian community. They didn't know what to do in these situations. So what do you think, you know, moving beyond Keystone, are the broad implications for our experience on social purpose organisations who support marginalised or stigmatised groups?
I mean, it's a very good question. I think the first thing to say, I suppose, is there are a couple of important boundary conditions about Keystone that I think it's important to explain, which kind of contextualizes the broader implications of the Keystone experience. I mean, one is that Keystone started off as a very positively socially evaluated organisation, and it became stigmatized. So that switch from very positively evaluated to highly negatively evaluated, I think, is a key part of the dynamic that we observed. And second of all, that happened really, really quickly. So it was over the matter of a few weeks and months that you had this transition. And I think that the level of the switch from highly positive to highly negative and the speed at which it happened, I think, contributed quite significantly to the trauma that was felt inside Keystone. And I think that that's quite different than if you start off as, so if Keystone started off as an organisation specifically designed to support migrants, for example, or another unpopular group, then I think the dynamics are quite different, because of course people inside kind of almost expect they're going to get flack, as it were. I think another really important kind of learning point from Keystone is the idea of secondary stigma transfer. So what I saw when I first arrived at Keystone was this transfer of stigma from a community of people, migrant workers, to the organisation. But then there was a secondary process of secondary stigmatisation from the organisation to the individual organisational members. And as you said, there was a lot of animosity and sometimes abuse directed at Keystone staff members, which, as you said, I experienced myself just for the fact of wearing a Keystone badge in the community or in the Thetford social housing estates. And what I sort of realised, and sort of from a slightly more theoretical standpoint, is that there was a lot of the people inside who were working at Keystone had this split identification. So they identified really strongly with Keystone as an organisation. It was their employer. They enjoyed working there. They liked it. But at the same time, they were also part of the working class communities and lived amongst the working class communities who were involved in processes of stigmatization. And so that was very traumatic. And so, yeah, that was very interesting to me. And I think the third thing that I learned, and this is really obvious to social innovators at the sharp end. I mean, if you speak to any social innovator, this is obvious to you at the time. When you speak to people who are involved in social justice work, they know that they're going to get flack along the way. You speak to people involved in the sector, they will tell you that. But that is not the reality that you read about in a lot of social innovation, social entrepreneurship research. It's mostly very fluffy stuff. It's very positive. There's a narrative about change makers. There's a lot of stuff about heroes and so on and so forth. And you don't hear about the other side, the contestation, the tension. And I think that is a kind of gaping hole in social innovation research that we need to study more often. And also, of course, I mean, we didn't really touch on this part of the story, but one of the elements of the Keystone story is that not all aspects of being negative, socially evaluated, being stigmatized turned out to be bad. It actually opened up a lot of opportunities for you because being very negatively socially evaluated means that you're more visible and other people are seeing the work that you're doing, and those who are aligned with your mission are then more likely to give you resources. So I think there's a number of important lessons for social purpose organizations more broadly, even though Keystone is one organization, it's a single case in a very specific set of circumstances supporting a particular group.
Excellent. I think we better hand back to Tom.
That was fantastic. Thank you so much. It's a fantastically interesting and important story. And I've asked for questions in the chat, and they've already begun. I want to start by asking a question from Rhonda Rieger, who asks, why do you think the stigma of the group spilled over on the organization, whereas the positive reputation of the organization didn't spill over onto the migrant group? Why didn't Keystone end up legitimating the migrants, and why did it spill over the other way?
Neil, do you want to...
Well, we certainly tried. I mean, that was the whole idea of integration work, is to try and, and the myth busting work was to try and bring people together into sort of more, not necessarily cohesive, but respect each other's differences and the similarities, and be able to engage on a day-to-day in levels at the school gates or whatever. I mean, Paul may have a better answer to this, but we did try. My instinct is it's racism, frankly. That people have already made decisions. Certain behaviours then reinforce those decisions. The press, locally and nationally, reinforced it, and it becomes this self-perpetuating decline. That was my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree with a lot of that. I think it was located in these really powerful societal level narratives around migration. I mean, I don't have them to show you, but I collected loads of Daily Mail clippings, front page headlines, and so that, and then there was a local narrative rolled on top of that, and I think that was just really, really powerful to fight against. And so Keystone got caught up in that. And as Neil said, we obviously didn't know it at the time, but what we saw were the dynamics that underpinned what became Brexit. And it won't surprise people in the audience to know that Thetford, Norfolk voted overwhelmingly to leave the European Union. These dynamics were at play.
So interesting. I want to pick up on one thing you said, and you went quickly by it, Neil, in your description of this the story. And it kind of ties to this in this sort of broader environment in which it's all occurring. And you mentioned allies. And most of the story, you don't talk very much about allies. You talk about the relationship between the enterprise and the community and the people in the community. What was the role of allies in all of this?
Well, I mean, in the latter part of the paper, the allies come to the fore. But the allies tend to be not local. They tend to be sort of regional and national. Okay, so there could be other organizations doing the same sort of stuff. But more often there were sort of public agencies at the regional and national level who were trying to deal with these issues at that level, looking at the experience of Thetford and Keystone and trying to learn from it, and liking what was happening, even though it was messy and unpleasant at times, and investing in it. So this is the unintended consequence that Paul highlighted in the paper of being stigmatized at a local level. The local allies, there were some, but they were few and far between. At best, there was silence. And this is something that really annoyed me at the time, the silence of the agencies at a local level.
Oh, interesting. I mean, this actually picks up on a question from Mark Thompson. And he picks up on the phrase you used about the working class community in Thetford, and what he suggests is it may have been more heterogeneous than homogeneous, and And how does that play out? How does the heterogeneity of the local community, not the agencies, but the actual population of Thetford, sort of fill into this? And how does it affect the role of stigma transfer and how you manage it?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think there was huge heterogeneity of views, and of course, it's not the case that all people on the West Thetford housing estates, where the Keystone was mostly working, that they were all against the migrants, of course, or all had these views. I think it's also important to make the point that the experience of the migrants was not homogenous either, and there was some really interesting dynamics that I think were in an earlier version of the paper, but we didn't have time to explore properly. About Keystone was actually getting flack in the early days from the leaders within the migrant community, because when all these problems happened, there was parts of the migrant community were filling the gaps, if you like, to come in and support people themselves. And so when Keystone came in to support them, that was seen by some people within the migrant community of actually taking resources of power influence away from Keystone. So there were a very complex set of community dynamics that in the research we don't really get the opportunity to explore. There was absolutely, in response to Mark's question, heterogeneity, but that was not only amongst the English people, working class people, it was also amongst the migrant community as well. Remember, the migrants were from many different countries, so they were sort of interesting dynamics that came through when I think I did 29 interviews with different people from different parts of the migrant community. It was really interesting to hear the variety of their experience as well.
How much of that was driven by, for instance, differences in language or the linguistic ability of different migrant groups?
Absolutely. Sorry, no, go for it.
So one thing I've learned after 30 years of being a community development person and then another X number of years studying it is that, we have very rosy, tinted view of the word of communities and what they consist of. Often, and especially in communities that are constrained for a number of reasons, mainly resource, poverty or whatever, can be very conflictual no matter what. Thetford was quite conflictual before all this happened. Mm. It was conflictual because as Paul said, the 1950s, 60s incomers from the East End of London didn't fit nicely with the more rural, sleepy 5,000 people lived there in the first place. But that's not unusual. That's not just, there are lots of places where there's multiple sources of friction. Hence our primary job was to reduce friction between peoples, be it young, old, black, white, whatever.
So can you say a little bit more about that, just in terms of, from your experience, the role of social enterprise in managing and embedding themselves in communities that are already in conflict or where conflicts are emerging? Do you think it has different effects on, say, the boundaries between the enterprise and the community, or different strategies you use?
Yes. I mean, as I possibly didn't explain terribly well at the beginning, a development trust is embedded in place. It's meant to have a long-term relationship with that place. You cannot get up and go. You can't say, we've had enough. These people are just too difficult or too challenging, off we hop. And it's there to try and make positive change in many different ways. Normally through creating opportunity and putting money into people's pockets through jobs, training, etc., in the hope that will then other positive things will happen. That's the essence of that type of social enterprise.
Great. So Kevin McSweeney has a question, and he says, you alluded to the positive benefits of stigma, and there's been recent research looking at different stigmatized kinds of industries and groups, including mixed martial arts and sex workers, to address the complexity of achieving legitimacy through different kinds of mechanisms. And what he's asking is, did you see stigma being used strategically? So you saw lots of heterogeneity of the groups and people. Was there also heterogeneity in terms of the relationship to stigma? Did anyone try and use it strategically? Did that evolve over the process?
I don't know if I'm better to answer that, or you, Neil. I don't know, but I can give my answer too. I mean, I think that as Keystone became well known amongst local resource providers for its work with migrants, there's no question that Keystone was quite strategic about leveraging that. Neil can talk more, to bring in resources for other types of work. So I mean, and I know this myself because Neil actually got me to tender for a work club and some youth clubs to help long-term unemployed young people back into work. And so I went to the local authority and I pitched the tender. And one of the things that came up in the conversation was about Meta, the work that was being done with migrants. And the sense that I got was that people felt, well, the competence that Keystone had exhibited in this difficult situation is probably going to have, you know, indicates or signals that they may well be competent to do other difficult projects as well. So I think that audiences saw, and Keystone was quite deliberate about talking about its successes with this difficult situation that they had, and using that to leverage other resources. I mean, there's other examples. Neil's probably a better place to talk.
Well, yes. I mean, obviously, Paul's absolutely right. It helps. It gives other people confidence in your abilities to do this sort of very challenging work. Because people in this sort of work know how hard it is and how easy it is to fail at it. So we had a sort of a peak period of, interest and opportunity to apply for grants, and bringing new resource into the area. Not necessarily just on migration issues, but as Paul said, tackling young people's worklessness or whatever it may be. So basically it was making hay while sun shined, while there was hail in the other window.
Because when I was there, Neil, I remember that you won a contract, a pilot for David Cameron's community organising programme. So David Cameron had this big national project that, British people may remember the Big Society policy initiative that David Cameron had many years ago. And part of that was having a whole national network of community organisers, a massive project. And so he piloted it in a small number of communities around the UK. And Keystone was one of the organisations that was picked. So they had about 8 community workers that they got free, with government money based at Keystone. That was a massive resource win. And one of the factors in that was very likely all the work that Keystone was doing with migrants at the time, which had become quite well known across government as well.
So there's another question from Mark Thompson asking about other actors in the community, and particularly actors in the community with strong reputations, lots of legitimacy, lots of cultural or social capital. The leaders in Thetford, and where were they in this? Were they people that you tried to enroll as allies? Were they keeping a distance from them? What was the story?
Well, we would not have set up Meta if the public bodies had stood up. We did win a joint bid, qualities bid, with the local council and others, police from Brightly, to promote the positive work. But when it got rather tricky and dirty, like I said, there was a bit of silence all round. Now, I'm not blaming people. This is challenging stuff. But there was a shortage of allies for a while. The moment when that sort of changed was we had one of the last sort of race riots in Thetford, bizarrely. England were playing Portugal. I'd been to the police station and said, "You have thought this through?" And they said yes, or they hadn't. And 100 people, not necessarily from Thetford, because the national press had picked it up, surrounded the Portuguese pub and, sort of besieged people within it. So I had a member of staff in there give me sort of 10-minute updates on it. That sort of, lanced the sort of the boil, as it were. And people started to say, well, this has just gone too far. We need to do something, Can
you tell us a bit more about in some sense, the end of the story? That this sounds like a very complex, embedded story where the social enterprise and Thetford are part of a much bigger story in terms of the politics of immigration in the UK. But there's also a Thetford trajectory that's kind of going on. And so, were you able to, do you think, influence the trajectory outside of the enterprise around these issues, or the acceptance of migrants in the community, or the capacity for migrants to organize, have agency, manage the stigma on their own? Is it a happy story? Is it a not happy story?
I think it's a mixed story, Tom. You know, um, like I said, you know, sometimes issues like this, you know, are never resolved. One has to keep working at it. One has to find new tactics and ways to deal with it. Part of the problem, in my opinion, is that we started to dismantle some of the boundaries around behaviours that allows people to behave badly. So when I worked at the City Council, I ran the Racial Harassment Service and the Race Equality Service. One was hearts and minds, one was carrot and stick. If you behave in a certain way, certain things will happen to you. Whereas the other one's more about, you know, that side has sort of been withdrawn a bit, you know, so people's behaviours were not challenged by public institutions. That's been the most alarming trend, in my opinion, that we're allowed to say or do things that perhaps we weren't in the past, aided and abetted, obviously, by online, you know, the Twitters and the Facebooks, etc. You know, certain behaviours should be curtailed, in my opinion.
We do have another paper, Tom. It's an institutional work paper, social symbolic work paper, which is focused on the external aspects. So thinking about what Keystone was doing as social symbolic work or institutional work, and you know, I think there are some really interesting things to explore, because it's really difficult to show clear effects, the link between types of social symbolic work and effects. But you know, there were really interesting things that Keystone did. I mean, some of which we talk about in the first paper, actually. But I mean, I think the idea that the way that Keystone talked about the town as existing as two sets of migrations, essentially, and showing the connection between the London overspill people in the 1960s, many of whom were the people who were upset about the migrants coming, or descendants of them, and this recent wave. And I thought there was some really interesting institutional social symbolic work that Keystone was doing to show very clearly, in quite precise ways, the shared experience of those migrations. And I thought that was interesting.
It is interesting, isn't it? And even the idea of who counts as a migrant, you know, has this sort of big historical kind of arc to it. And so, okay, so let me ask one more update test question in terms of Keystone. So Keystone and Brexit, has it had an impact on Thetford and Keystone? I know you're not there anymore, but I presume you have a window into it.
Yeah, I mean, one part of the story we've not been, you know, told today is, you know, one of the key things was to make Keystone sustainable. And what we did is build a property portfolio, quite significant portfolio, some commercial, some social, that would allow the organisation to be sustainable over time. Notwithstanding the 2008 crash and recent events. So Keystone still exists. It's possibly a bit, you know, had to withdraw a bit, you know, because of resources. But hopefully it's one of those organisations, again, there are many across the UK, that, you know, when you water it, it'll blossom again, because the roots are there in the community. Obviously, you know, there's still migration and, you know, there's still issues, perhaps not as extreme at one level as they were at that particular period in time. But like I said, this does not go away. You know, impacts on you in Oxford, impacts in Cambridge. It's a living issue, you know, for many people.
Great, thank you. I want to ask you each a question about yourselves in this, or at least from the perspective of your kind of specific roles. And maybe start with Paul around research. And I guess I kind of have two questions, and maybe you can answer either one or both if you want, but you can choose. So one question I have is, you mentioned business schools as institutions in this, and them not being such great places to study social innovation because we never meet the people who are motivating social innovation in the first place. And so I guess I'm wondering, you now run a center, you have, unlimited power and authority at Cambridge. And so I'm just wondering, from your position, how would you change business schools given your experience in this? If I put you in charge, what would you change?
Well, I mean, I think that there's two ways to answer this question. One is on the research side. I think things already are changing, like the sorts of methods that are acceptable in our field. It's interesting. I think this was an action research project, but I would never have called it that. In fact, I didn't call it that. When we submitted to AMJ, it was called the term was participant observation. And I think that people are now talking or having a conversation about action research, and the whole discourse around impact is much more about what we can do to, through our research, actually make a difference in what we're doing. So some things are already changing around method. But there's also another really important part, which is around teaching, partly what we teach the MBA programs, but also actually making a space within business schools to discuss those issues, and to have the opportunity for professionals in social innovation, social entrepreneurship to come in and in educating them, to give them a different type of experience. I mean, I'm thinking in our master's program in social innovation, for example, we have so many different people come in to speak, including an anarchist. Neil got an anarchist in to speak, for instance. You talked about what it's like to be arrested and all this stuff. So a very different perspective on making social change, I think. So, but more broadly, I just think we need to be taking issues around poverty and inequality much more seriously than we are. I mean, there is, as you know, a discourse now talk about how we integrate the Sustainable Development Goals into our research and so. But the stuff that I'm seeing at the moment, again, it's from 1,000 feet. It's very sanitized, and the voices of the people who are at the sharp end of inequality, it's often missing. Often it's about what these amazing social entrepreneurs are doing to change the world, and the real fine-grained stuff is just not there.
So I want to push you a little bit further on that, because we both had experience trying to elevate those voices, and it's not an easy challenge to meet in the context of a business school, or frankly, actually, almost any middle-class driven organizational context is really not that easy to do. And I just wonder actually if you have, either you or Neil, suggestions, so that lots of people on the call today are interested exactly in social innovation and the sharp end of poverty and inequality. And I think you're exactly right that the voices of people who are suffering from those conditions are difficult to surface directly. And so have you tried to do that? Have you had experience doing that?
No, I've got one thought on that before I hand over to Neil. That is, oftentimes I think we end up studying people who are very, very different to ourselves, and that creates a whole different set of issues and problems. I mean, in Keystone, I was in a community that I managed to connect with, but obviously their background was very different from mine. I mean, at the moment, I'm on sabbatical just now, Tom, and my plan originally in the sabbatical had been to go to my hometown where I grew up, to live with my parents, and to do another participant observation, this time in a local social enterprise in my hometown, where my mom knows the founder, supporting local drug addicted people. And I thought that would be really interesting because although obviously I'm not the same as the beneficiaries, I'm not the same as the people who are running the social enterprise, I just felt that I might have a degree of cultural knowledge that would bring insight, because I know what it's like to grow up there. I know what the people, I understand who they are. And I thought, wouldn't that be really interesting if I could go back to my hometown and really leverage that cultural knowledge, rather than, I'm working with a lot of students who are studying very exotic issues and problems all around the world, but I'm struggling, supervising them to really get the detailed cultural knowledge that I need to get under the surface of the issues that they're studying. I think that's a really big challenge, and I can see other people struggling with that as well.
Thank you. Neil, do you want to chime in on that?
Well, just before I do, I mean, one of the impacts, if you like, of Paul coming to Keystone, quite significant impact, is the creation of the Cambridge Centre for Social Innovation. That wouldn't have happened if we hadn't spent many months talking about the world, the issues, business schools, what could be done. So, that's got a positive impact for researchers joining an organisation. I think it's about alliances, and a lot of my work is with people who were like me doing that sort of work now, and spending time over time with them to surface ideas, and also helping people express what they'd like us to talk about in different ways. It's not easy. It's challenging. It does take a lot of patience. So it doesn't really fit in necessarily with what your other metrics are, hitting AMJ or whatever. But I think it's, if we do want to make change, and we want to be more than just business schools, using Martin Parker's idea of schools of organising that looks at organising public, not-for-profit, etc., in a very different way, we do need to change somewhat.
Thank you. We are 2 minutes from the end, and I know people book their lives these days back to back, and so I don't want to jeopardize losing people before I have a chance to thank you. This was a fantastic beginning to this series. Your experience, both of you, in this project and in Keystone and Thetford is both illuminating and inspiring, and I really appreciate your time, effort, your care, the energy that went into the project and the energy that went into today. I'm going to make a little advertisement plug just before we leave. The 31st of March, the last day of this month, we're having our second SOAR seminar, and I hope you all come back for it. Paul and Neil, I hope you come back for it. Daphne Dimitri, who was previously a postdoc in the Center for Corporate Reputation and is now a faculty member at McGill University, and Todd Schiffling are going to be talking about food trucks, authenticity, and community-based entrepreneurship. So some related issues and in a very different context. So I hope we'll see you there. And with that, I'll just say thank you, and thank you all for coming, and we'll see you hopefully in person at some point in our lives. So thank you again, Paul and Neil.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Tom.